The Iron Heel by Jack London, book review. So this is one of those books that was on my list of books to read forever. Like I've been wanting to read this book for a long time, and I kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. And then when I finally got around to reading it, I thought, well, this is great. This is so readable, so fun and easy to read. I don't know why I put it off for ages. You ever have a book like that? Like something you feel like you should read, you keep procrastinating on it because you're worried it will be difficult, but then once you start it, it's just so easy to read. You're like, oh, I should have done this ages ago. So, Jack London. I've enjoyed Jack London's nature books in my youth when I was a boy. Call of the Wild and White Fang were some of my favorite books in middle school, in part because I really liked wolves. I was going through this phase where I was a big kind of nature nut and really liked wolves. And Jack London also really likes wolves. But Jack London, even though he's kind of most famous for these winter nature books, was also a big socialist. So he had some political books. The most famous of his political books is The Iron Heel, which is a book about kind of the socialist movement. It's kind of an imagined future, but it's very heavy on the socialist themes. Now, I forget where, but I've been kind of picking up bits and pieces of this book and kind of various things I've been reading. I heard somewhere that the dystopian view of the future that's in The Iron Heel apparently was a big influence on George Orwell in 1984. 1984 is one of my favorite books of all time, so I thought, okay, I should read The Iron Heel. Also, I picked up somewhere when I was looking for fictional portrayals of the Paris Commune that in this book there's a Chicago Commune. Jack London is kind of imagining a future, so it didn't really happen in real life, but in the imagined alternative universe of this book, there is a Chicago Commune. So that also got me interested. And then once I finally got around to reading it, yeah, it was just so easy to read, a pleasure to read, which I should have known really because Jack London's books have always been easy to read. I can remember as a boy kind of reading Call of the Wild and White Fang and finding them very easy to read. Now, it's not necessarily great literature. There's some flaws in the plotting and the themes. But in terms of the prose is just so readable. Okay, the first half of the book is kind of a manifesto masquerading itself as a novel. Again, it's not great literature, but it is easy to read. So there's a main character who's Ernest Everhard, and he's a socialist, and he kind of goes around debating various critics. For example, he argues with capitalists, he argues with priests, he argues with the petit bourgeois, and every time they argue against him, he always trounces them soundly. Like he always just blows all their arguments out of the water. Now, that's partly because Jack London is a socialist, so Jack London wants him to win. So he's arguing against straw men a little bit. Also, while he's doing all these arguments and kind of demonstrating that his socialist theory is so superior to everybody, capitalist and religious theory, there are all these comments about how handsome and charming he is, to the extent that it almost gets a little bit like self-parody. Like, not only is socialism the brilliant argument, but all socialists are so handsome and charming. I almost expected like one of those priests, the priests are kind of like the bad guys in this book. One of those priests to say something like, "Blast those socialists. Their intellectual cunning is matched only by their stunning good looks." Yet at the same time, it's highly readable. And a benefit of this section is that Marx's economic theories are explained in very readable prose. So for example, there's a section where the main character, again, Ernest Everhard, is explaining why capitalism is doomed to destruction because of the crisis of overproduction. Now, this is something I think that was from Marx in Das Kapital, but, you know, I mean, good luck reading or understanding Das Kapital, right? Or kind of any of Marx's philosophical books. Whereas in London, it's just so simple, so easy to understand. He explains it so that an idiot could understand it, which is good for me. I was able to understand it very clearly out of London. Now, the second half of this book is where the plot kicks in. And then this is kind of an alternative future. Or, yeah, I guess it was a vision of the future at the time. The book was published in 1908. So obviously from our standpoint now, we know that the 20th century didn't turn out like that, but this is what kind of London imagined it might turn out like. Now, London is imagining that there will be a socialist revolution at some point and everything will be wonderful. But he's of the opinion that things have to get worse before they get better. So once the capitalists realize that a socialist revolution is in the cards, they band together and they form a brutal oligarchic government in the United States, which is called the Iron Heel. That's the name of the government. There's a socialist rebellion in the form of the Chicago Commune, but it's brutally put down, and the book ends on kind of a depressing note. But it's, so the book ends with all the kind of characters kind of being brutally put down by the oligarchic government. But at the same time, it's not depressing because the whole book, as you're reading it, it's a diary by Everhard's wife, and it's being annotated by a historian who's annotating it from 7 centuries in the future. So we know that eventually this socialist utopia does get around to happening at some point in the distant future, and the historian is annotating the diary from the standpoint of the socialist utopia, even though the characters described in the diary don't get to see that revolution. They're in the part where the brutal government is putting them down. Now, the fictional historian will kind of make all these comments like, this appears to be something in the diary, this appears to be a reference towards something called stealing, which we don't have nowadays, but was rampant in the 19th century and the 20th century, in the days when people still had private property and the wealth distribution was unequal. I'm parroting a little, I'm having fun with it a little, but it's very similar to that in tone. Now, some of what London predicts, like this whole brutal repression of the Chicago Commune, seems a little bit extreme. I mean, like, I know like the US government has done some bad stuff, but London is predicting kind of in the near future a massacre in Chicago by a repressive government in the United States. However, he keeps at least one foot in reality by using his footnotes. So when he's talking about the fictional Chicago Commune, in his footnotes he says, okay, this is not so far removed from reality. Remember, we had the Haymarket massacre in Chicago. So yeah, he does kind of tie it back to actual history like that. Now, looking at it from our standpoint in the 21st century, it's interesting to see which of his predictions turned out to be right and which turned out to be wrong. He did, all the way back in 1908, he did forecast the rise of fascism, which, you know, fortunately wasn't victorious, but was a big thing in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And yeah, he thought he had a glim view of the immediate future. He thought it was going to get a lot worse before it got better. Again, kind of as socialists became more powerful, or socialist theory became more organized, London foresaw that there was going to be a reaction against this, which, yeah, turned out to be fascism. Also, he predicted World War I. Although, I don't know how much credit he gets for this. I was reading somewhere recently that around this time, 1908, kind of everybody was predicting a big European war. I guess kind of anybody with any brains could see that Europe was a powder keg waiting to happen by that time. But for whatever it's worth, he did kind of predict a big European war. Now, what London got wrong is he predicted that the socialist movement would stop this war, that there would be enough international solidarity, because socialists are not supposed to fight international wars. Socialists are only supposed to fight class war. So like a French socialist is not supposed to sign up in the army to go fight Germany. They're just supposed to fight, the capitalists in their own country. And to be fair, my understanding, based on the history classes I took, is that this is what people expected at the time. People thought that the international socialist movement might be strong enough to stop kind of a big international war. What actually happened instead was that the war hysteria was so severe that the socialists actually just joined in with their own countries. So the French socialists and the German socialists and a lot of the Russian socialists just kind of ended up supporting their own countries. There were extreme radical examples like Eugene Debs and Rosa Luxemburg and Emma Goldman of kind of far left socialists who refused to support the war. But most of the moderate socialists ended up supporting World War I. And in fact, even some of the far left anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, far left anarchist in Russia, ended up supporting World War I. Interesting side note, Emma Goldman in her autobiography talks about how devastated she was when she learned that Peter Kropotkin had ended up supporting the war. Anyways, back to the book. London also predicted the Great Depression, and he predicted that this would be caused by the overproduction of capitalism, which my understanding is that it kind of was. He predicted anti-colonial movements. He predicted the rise of fascism in Japan, and he even predicted that Japan would try and become an imperial power and would kind of use the guise of Pan-Asianism as its excuse to kind of colonize its neighbors. So he predicted all that. He got a lot of stuff right. And also, he predicted that the labor movement in the United States could be defeated if the leaders of the unions were co-opted by the system and kind of given a stake in the capitalist system. Right again, yeah. So anyways, he got a lot right, he got a lot wrong. The book is not great literature. It's a little bit too heavy on the polemics. But Jack London is somebody who I always find easy to read. So I'd recommend it on that note.